Hey guys, welcome back to GX Stories Sleeping. Tonight we're heading somewhere you probably wouldn't last more than a few nights without seriously regretting your life choices. Picture this: a cold, slate gray sea foaming around the edges of a jagged volcanic island. That's medieval Iceland greeting you. If you can call being slapped by salt-crusted winds and nearly blown off your feet a greeting, your lips chap within minutes. Your eyes sting from the sheer icy force of it, and somewhere deep in your brain, that survival alarm starts to go off. This is going to be rough. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your location and local time down below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stumbling off a clinker-built Nar, that classic Viking cargo ship with a hull slicked in tar and barnacles. Your boots hit wet gravel, and immediately the cold shoots up your legs. You half expect a welcoming inn with a roaring fire, some frothy ale, maybe a bard tuning a lute. Sorry, this is 12th century Iceland, and there's no bustling harbor town waiting to receive you. Instead, a few locals in heavy cloaks watch from a safe distance, sizing you up with wary eyes. They've seen too many strangers freeze or starve here to get emotionally invested. You clutch your modern-day puffer jacket tighter, but it's no match for these North Atlantic gusts. Historical fact: average winter temperatures in medieval Iceland often hovered just above freezing, but combined with savage winds and damp air, it cut through skin and bone alike. And if you're hoping to warm up later with a quick espresso, beans won't even arrive in Europe for a couple centuries. You're stuck with sour whey. The smell is something you can't quite place. Sharp salt from the sea, smoke from distant peat fires, and the faint, rank odor of drying fish. Here's your quirky tidbit. Many Icelanders back then used rotting shark flesh, called hakarl, not only for food, but also as a kind of rugged bar snack, washed down with Brennivin centuries later. Some argue whether such fermentation methods were more necessity or grim local pride. Scholars still debate if it was first adopted purely for preservation, or if there was some oddly prestigious bragging right in stomaching ammonia-rich flesh. As you take a cautious step inland, the ground feels weirdly soft. That's because you're walking over volcanic ash mixed with moss and brittle tufts of grass. Your breath makes little puffs in the air. A gaggle of sheep eyes you suspiciously, then darts off, wool swaying like ghostly lanterns. And you start to realize that medieval Iceland isn't the wide, green Viking saga landscape you might have pictured. It's rugged, treeless, with only short, stubborn vegetation gripping the black soil. By now, your toes are numb, your fingertips tingling in that ominous way that hints at frostbite. Someone motions for you to follow up a narrow path. You oblige, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground. Overhead, gulls scream, the sound eerily amplified by cliffs. You're so cold your teeth chatter, making a tiny, ridiculous clicking rhythm. Here's your first truly sobering moment. You're barely an hour on land, and already your body is starting to burn through precious energy reserves, just trying to stay warm. Better hope tonight's sleeping arrangements are less grim than your gut tells you. You follow the locals along a winding trail that cuts through dark lava fields and marshy low spots until you finally reach what looks like a grassy mound. It's squat, with a low door that seems sized for children or very humble trolls. This is your first look at a traditional Icelandic turf house. Outside, the wind howls, scraping across the mossy roof like claws. Inside, you hope there's a roaring fire, maybe even a bench with wool blankets. Spoiler alert, you're about to be disappointed. You duck through the narrow wooden door and immediately smack your forehead on the lintel. Your eyes water. Not just from pain, but from thick, stinging smoke that clings to every surface inside. The hearth sits in the center of the dirt floor, little more than a shallow pit with glowing embers. There's no chimney, just a small hole in the roof that occasionally dribbles down icy droplets along with letting out the smoke. Your eyes stream, your nose runs, and your lungs feel scraped raw. A modern doctor would probably diagnose your future with chronic smoke inhalation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Most Icelandic homes until the 19th century were turf houses. Timber was far too scarce, so settlers layered birch twigs, slabs of sod, and rough stones to create thick, insulating walls. It was a clever solution, holding in precious heat, but it also meant houses stayed damp, dark, and permanently smoky. A fringe tidbit for you? Some sagas describe turf houses as practically alive, breathing with drafts, groaning under wind, even growing tiny mushrooms inside on moist days. Someone gestures you over to a pile of sheepskins. Bed, they grunt. You try to smile, grateful for anything soft. You sink into it, and immediately realize you're wedged up against 3 other people, plus a snoring dog. Personal space is a modern fantasy. Their breath, mixed with sweat and lingering fish oil, fills the close air. You shift uncomfortably, your boot accidentally nudging someone's backside. They grunt and roll over, taking most of the thin wool cover with them. Scholars still argue about how much privacy medieval Icelanders actually valued. Some say shared beds fostered close family bonds and communal warmth, while others point to evidence of frequent disputes and even occasional violent quarrels started right on the sleeping benches. Your head spins slightly from the mingled smells: smoke, damp wool, sour milk, unwashed bodies, and you try to breathe shallow. A tickle on your ankle makes you freeze. Was that a flea? Or worse? You don't want to know. As night swallows what little gray daylight existed, the turf house feels more like a cave. The single oil lamp sputters low, shadows playing along the earthen walls. Someone coughs wetly. The floor creaks as another sleeper shifts. Outside, the wind roars with renewed force, battering the sod roof so hard, tiny clumps of dirt sprinkle down on your hair. You flinch, brushing it away. The dog beside you twitches in a dream, pawing at your leg. You pull your borrowed cloak tighter, every muscle tense. This is night 1. You have a dozen more reasons ahead why you probably won't survive the cold nights of medieval Iceland. But for now, it's enough just to shiver, eyes stinging, ears full of wind and coughing, trying to imagine morning ever coming. Morning limps in grudgingly, not with a bright sunrise, but with a barely perceptible shift from inky black to a dull, pewter sky. You stumble outside the turf house, lungs greedy for the cold, clean air, until your nose immediately regrets it. The chill is so sharp, it's like inhaling knives. You watch your breath swirl out in desperate little puffs, half expecting them to freeze and fall to the ground. It doesn't take long to notice something missing. Trees. Sure, you'd heard that Iceland was largely treeless by medieval times, but seeing it is another matter. There's an eerie openness to the landscape. Rolling fields of moss and stones, broken by black lava ridges, but hardly a trunk in sight. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 12th century, deforestation from early Norse settlers cutting down birch and willow for building and grazing had left most of Iceland starkly bare. Without forests, firewood became a nearly mythical commodity. So what do the locals burn to keep warm? That's where it gets both clever and gross. They pile up dried seaweed, twisted sticks of driftwood scavenged from beaches. When they're lucky, and, most often, cakes of sheep dung. Yes, you watch them pat down moist, greenish lumps into tidy rounds, stacking them to dry like loaves of bread. Once hardened, these dung patties smolder with a surprising steadiness. It's oddly efficient, even if the smell is, well, pungent enough to make your eyes water all over again. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic families even used fish bones for fuel. Picture a pile of brittle cod spines and heads crackling away in the hearth, sending up a ghostly reek of old ocean. Historians still squabble over how widespread this practice was. Some think it was common in coastal settlements. Others argue it was more an emergency measure during harsh winters when literally anything that could burn would be tried. You try to warm your hands over one of these humble hearths later in the day. The heat feels pathetically thin compared to your memory of a wood stove or a modern radiator. It warms only the palms of your hands. The backs of them stay numb. Your breath continues to float around you in tiny white ghosts, and every few minutes, you stamp your feet to make sure your toes haven't gone completely dead. A local woman laughs at you gently, offering a scrap of wool to wrap around your neck. Her cheeks are ruddy, her eyes bright, but her hands are cracked and raw, little red fissures from years of work in this abrasive cold. You want to ask how she stands it, this perpetual ache in the bones. But then again, What else would she compare it to? For her, this is simply living. The wind picks up again, pushing you sideways with a playful cruelty. Somewhere out on the lava field, sheep huddle together in a tight, shivering clump. You envy their thick wool. Your mind drifts to the idea of fleeing back to your ship and heading for a warmer land. But the truth is, even if you left now, it might already be too late. Your body is using up precious reserves, the kind it can't replenish on dried fish and sour whey alone. By the time another night falls, you're desperately hoping for some miracle. A sudden warming breeze, maybe, or a magical hot spring right inside the turf house. No luck. You crawl back inside to your little pile of hay and wool, exhausted from trudging all day across fields that seem to stretch forever. The hearth glows weakly, barely illuminating the smoky interior. You wrap your cloak tighter, trying to hold in what pitiful body heat you've managed to generate. You collapse onto the bedding and pull a rough blanket over your head. Underneath, it smells of damp wool, old sweat, and a faint mustiness that could either be mold or just centuries of unwashed bodies. Probably both. Your bed is little more than a cloth sack stuffed with straw. Every time you shift, it crunches and pokes through the thin fabric, needling your ribs. You try to drift off, but the cold creeps in anyway, prying under the blanket, licking at your toes, then your knees, then worming up your back. You press your hands between your thighs for warmth, but even they feel like lumps of ice. You try to breathe through your mouth so you don't have to smell everything, but then your lips dry out and start to crack. Your breath puffs out in quick, frightened little clouds, visible even under the blanket. Here's your mainstream historical fact to keep your mind busy. Medieval Icelanders often woke up with actual frost lining their eyebrows and beards. Turf houses insulated well compared to stone or wood alone, but they were still drafty and damp. In truly bitter nights, your breath could freeze right onto your face, giving you a crust of rime that felt strangely beautiful, until the icy melt dribbled down your neck. For a moment, you almost doze. Then something scuttles across your shoulder. You bolt upright, heart racing, fumbling at your clothes. A flea? A louse? Worse? You remember hearing how common bedbugs and lice were. A quirky little tidbit. Some medieval folk believed lice kept you healthy by feeding on bad blood. A truly comforting thought as you itch along your collarbone. Meanwhile, scholars still argue over just how relentless the indoor cold actually was. Some claim turf houses, packed with people and animals, could be almost stifling at night. Others point to sagas describing breath-freezing midair, and villagers waking up with hair stiff as tiny icicles. It's likely the truth lay somewhere in between, depending on how well built a home was, or how many warm bodies were packed inside. You finally pull the blanket back over your head and squeeze your eyes shut. The darkness feels heavy, like it's pressing right on your chest. Outside, the wind moans, slipping through every crack. It sounds almost like voices, thin, pleading. You tell yourself it's just the wind, but you curl tighter anyway. At some point, you drift into a shallow, haunted sleep. Your dreams are full of endless white fields, shadowy figures moving just out of reach. When you wake again, your eyelashes are stuck together with frost, and your breath curls away in tiny sighs, disappearing into the frigid dark. When the pale light of morning finally creeps in, you don't feel rested, just grateful you didn't die in your sleep. You sit up slowly, every joint aching, and brush tiny frost crystals from your lashes. Then comes the real horror, scratching. Not from yourself, but from your neighbors, human and otherwise. Someone nearby lifts their shirt, inspecting red, angry bites. You suddenly feel your own skin crawl. Icelandic turf houses might keep out the worst of the cold, but they're prime breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and mice. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Almost every medieval European household battled parasites daily. In Iceland's damp, crowded huts, it was even more inevitable. Clean laundry was a luxury, baths were infrequent, and soap was rare enough to seem almost decadent. You scratch absently at your shoulder and try to ignore it. Then you spot something darting under a straw pile. A fat little rat. It pauses to stare at you with beady eyes, whiskers twitching, before vanishing into a dark corner. The locals hardly react. They're used to sharing space with rodents. After all, they eat the scraps no one wants, and sometimes they're blamed for stealing souls at night. A superstition that makes you yank your blanket a bit tighter around your feet. That brings you to today's fringe tidbit. Some medieval Icelanders believed a mysterious condition called land plague, thought to be a kind of evil spirit or creeping curse, caused livestock to sicken and sometimes entire families to waste away. Later scholars argued these were outbreaks of anthrax or sheep diseases, but no one can quite agree. Even today, debates swirl around old saga references to sudden mass die-offs of animals and people, wondering whether it was disease, harsh climate, or pure folklore fear. You spend part of the day trying to help clean up the tiny living area. That means shaking out woolen cloaks, fluffing straw, and chasing off a stray dog that tried to snatch yesterday's fish scraps. Meanwhile, your nose never stops itching. The earthy, slightly rotten smell of damp turf walls mixes with old milk and sweat in a way that keeps your stomach uneasy. At least the people seem resignedly friendly. One old man laughs at how clumsily you handle a bundle of hay. He gestures to your fumbling hands, then to your neck where you keep scratching. With a rueful grin, he plucks something tiny off your collar, flicks it into the fire, and pats your shoulder like, "Welcome to Iceland." That night, you lie back down among the same itchy blankets, trying not to think of what's crawling just under the surface. Outside, the wind kicks up again, rattling the turf walls, whistling through unseen holes. A draft slithers right across your ankles, as if a ghostly hand decided to check how close your toes are to frostbite. You squeeze your eyes shut, counting your breaths. Each inhale tastes of smoke and wool. Each exhale forms a tiny cloud that seems to hover accusingly before dissolving into the dark. You can't help but wonder how many more nights your body can handle this cocktail of biting cold, creeping pests, and that lurking sense you're never truly alone in the dark. Something always scratches, always whispers, just out of sight. You lose track of how many days it's been. The sun barely peaks above the horizon now, just a sickly orange glow that vanishes almost as soon as it arrives. The long darkness settles over you like a heavy, damp cloak. Each day feels shortened, but each night seems to last forever. You're living through an Icelandic winter, where daylight sometimes shrinks to a mere 4 hours. Your internal clock gives up, leaving you in a sluggish fog. People move slower, speak more softly, and spend hours clustered near the dim hearth telling stories. Here's your mainstream historical fact. This was the heart of Icelandic saga culture. With little light and fewer chores to do in winter, families would spin elaborate tales, heroic, eerie, sometimes downright tragic, to fill the crushing hours of darkness. Tonight, you sit near the fire, rubbing your hands together for warmth, listening to a woman recite a story about a feud so bitter that 2 families slaughtered each other's livestock until none were left. A baby fusses nearby. Someone else weaves on a small loom, the click of wood a lonely counterpoint to the tale. Then comes your quirky tidbit. Some Icelanders believed certain hills and rocks were haunted by huldufolk, hidden people, elf-like beings who lived just beyond normal sight. These spirits were blamed for misplaced tools, sick sheep, even children falling ill. In fact, there's still scholarly debate about whether these beliefs were rooted more in Norse traditions or homegrown Icelandic fears of the endless dark. Even today, construction projects in modern Iceland have been delayed to avoid disturbing supposed elf dwellings. As the saga winds down, someone tosses another slab of dried dung onto the embers. It flares with a sputter, briefly illuminating the smoky beams overhead. The wind presses against the turf walls, whining like something alive. You shift uncomfortably. The darkness feels deeper here than anything you've known, more complete. It has a texture, almost a weight, like it could press you into the floor if you let it. Every night is the same haunting routine. Long hours with only faint lamp glow, surrounded by the soft murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter that sounds almost forced. Then the lamps are snuffed out, plunging everything into a sticky, absolute black. You lie there, eyes open, seeing nothing, your ears stretching for the smallest sound. Was that just a shifting sleeper, or did something brush against the outside wall? Eventually, you drift into a shallow sleep. Dreams here are different too. The dark leaks into them, mixing your fears with the stories you've heard. You dream of ghostly figures drifting between lava rocks, of faces just out of reach whispering your name. When you wake, you're not sure how long you've been asleep, or even if you ever truly were. Your stomach growls, reminding you that even in these long nights, hunger never really sleeps. You turn over, pressing your cheek into the rough straw, and try to comfort yourself with the thought that at least you're not out there, alone on the frozen tundra, listening to the cold breathe all by itself. Morning, or what passes for it, breaks with a thin, watery light that struggles to creep through gaps in the turf walls. When you step outside, your breath hangs in the air, curling around your head like a tiny ghost, before fading into the frosty breeze. Your stomach reminds you of its emptiness, with a low, desperate twist. Food here is not the kind of comforting spread you'd find in your cozy modern kitchen. No fresh fruit, no steaming plates of vegetables, certainly no pastries. Instead, you're handed a strip of dried cod so tough, it might double as a shoe insole. You gnaw on it while trying to ignore the salty, almost dusty flavor. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Fish, especially stockfish, wind-dried without salt, was the backbone of Icelandic diets for centuries. Hung on racks outside to cure in the frigid air, it could last months, even years. Then someone offers you a small cube of something grayish and waxy. You pop it in your mouth without thinking, and instantly gag. It's hakarl, that infamous fermented shark. Sharp, ammonia-rich, almost like chewing on a cleaning rag. Your eyes water, and a few locals chuckle under their breath. They're used to newcomers nearly vomiting on their first taste. A quirky little tidbit. Even today, Icelanders still enjoy hakarl on special occasions, and there's long-standing debate about whether the tradition started purely as a desperate way to avoid starvation or evolved into a point of national pride. Proof they could stomach what no one else dared. Later, someone ladles out a thin soup made from whey left over from cheese making. It's sour, with a hint of something musky you can't quite place. No bread to dip in it. Grain is far too precious, mostly imported from Norway or England when weather allowed. You slurp it anyway, trying not to picture yourself wasting away. There's a curious tension here. These people laugh and joke, even with bellies half empty. They share stories about better harvest long ago or boast about who once caught the fattest seal. But you notice how every eye sharpens when food is mentioned. Every scrap is accounted for, each mouthful measured in someone's mind. Scholars still pick at records trying to determine just how close medieval Icelanders lived to the brink of starvation each winter. Some argue they balance cleverly on the edge with dried fish and sour milk. Others believe many quietly suffered from chronic undernourishment, shortened lives the unspoken cost of this stark beauty. As night seeps back across the sky far too early, you sit with your back to a turf wall, chewing on yet another strip of fish. The salt stings the tiny cracks in your lips. Across from you, someone works quietly on repairing a net by lamplight, their fingers cracked and raw. A child rocks back and forth on a low bench, humming an old lullaby that sounds more like a morning song. You pull your cloak tighter, stomach still hollow, wondering how long a person can live on such meager fare. Wondering how many more nights like this you could really endure before your ribs begin to show sharp beneath your skin, or before your legs lose their strength to carry you across these endless black fields. By now, you've realized that sheep are absolutely everything out here. They're your clothing, your food, your fuel source, literally your lifeline. During the day, you shuffle after a small flock across frosted pastures, your breath billowing with theirs in the chilly air. The animal's warm, rank scent actually comforts you a little. After all, it's one of the only genuinely warm things around. You watch a shepherd scoop up a young lamb and tuck it into his cloak. At first, you think he's being oddly affectionate. Then you realize it's survival. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Sheep in medieval Iceland were more than simple livestock. They provided milk, cheese, meat, hides, wool for clothing, and even dung for fuel. Losing too many over a harsh winter could mean total ruin for an entire household. There's a tender side to this dependence. Sometimes, to keep the smallest lambs alive through bitter nights, families would literally sleep with them, cradling them close to share precious body heat. It's strangely sweet until you remember why it's necessary. If the lamb dies, so might you by next season, when food runs short. Your quirky tidbit? Icelanders used to joke that their most reliable friends were their sheep. Some medieval verses even addressed sheep as though they were loyal drinking companions. Modern historians still debate whether this was purely playful poetry, or if it hints at how emotionally intertwined people were with their flocks, almost blurring the lines between animal and kin. But affection has its limits. As summer fades, the mood shifts. Slaughter season arrives with the first deep frosts. One morning, you help drive the flock into a makeshift pen, listening to the anxious bleats that echo off black stone ridges. The smell of blood soon hangs thick in the crisp air. It gets into your hair, under your nails. By dusk, the grass runs slick, and you find yourself sick to your stomach, haunted by the eyes of lambs you'd seen only days before, nuzzling trustingly against rough hands. No one seems to weep openly. They joke a bit more loudly, slap each other on the shoulders, but there's a tightness in every smile. They're grateful for the meat and hides, thankful to stack up fattened bones that might see them through winter's deepest claws. But even they can't quite hide how grim it feels. Later that night, you curl up on your hay bed, pulling a cloak tighter around your shoulders. Outside, the wind combs through the turf roof with cold fingers. You swear you still hear faint bleating, long after the pens have gone quiet. Maybe it's just your guilty mind replaying the day. Or maybe, out here where stories and fears dance so easily with the night, you wouldn't be surprised if the spirits of those small, warm bodies wandered a while before settling. You breathe out slowly, trying to focus on how the wool blankets scratch your chin, how your own breath still fogs. You're alive, you remind yourself, thanks to the sheep. But even gratitude doesn't quite push away the hollow, unsettled feeling that burrows deeper than the cold ever could. You wake in the dark again, throat dry, stomach tight with a gnawing hollowness. The turf house is eerily still, only the faint wheeze of someone's sleep breathing breaking the silence. When you step outside at dawn, the sky's a bruised purple, and the grass crunches under your feet, so rimed with frost it looks like tiny shattered glass. A thin, hopeful part of you expects to smell something hearty cooking, maybe a stew bubbling on a hearth. But there's nothing, no savory scents, no comforting warmth drifting out from doorways. Instead, the entire settlement seems to move a little slower, shoulders hunched, faces pinched. You've stepped right into one of medieval Iceland's cruelest realities, the ever-looming threat of starvation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The climate here was never easy, but during the so-called Little Ice Age, which began in the late Middle Ages, conditions got even harsher. Shorter growing seasons, unpredictable storms, failed hay harvests. In a place so reliant on grass to feed sheep and cows, one ruined summer could spell doom for the entire winter. You watch as people pick through meager stores, barrels of sour whey, racks of dried fish that look more brittle each day, crusts of dark bread speckled with something you hope is just rough flour. When there's not enough grain, they stretch it with ground-up bark or moss. Your quirky tidbit? In some winters, Icelanders even boiled old leather shoes to make a sort of desperate broth. Scholars still squabble over whether these tales were exaggerated moral warnings, medieval cautionary horror stories, or all too real accounts of survival scraping. By afternoon, a storm sweeps in without warning, blasting the settlement with icy sleet. You huddle inside the turf house again, grateful for its insulating walls, even if it means choking on smoke and sharing breath with everyone else. Outside, wind roars over the hills so fiercely that the entire house seems to sigh and creak, like it's alive and shivering too. When the storm finally passes, people step out to assess the damage. Snowdrifts cover the grazing land. The few sheep that hadn't yet been slaughtered stand huddled together, their wool already crusted with ice. If the weather stays like this, there won't be enough pasture left by spring. Conversations turn hushed and tight. You catch glances traded between families, calculating eyes, measuring who has what stores left. Scholars still debate exactly how often true famine struck medieval Iceland. Sagas talk of families forced to split apart, sending children to distant relatives to lighten the burden, or even abandoning homesteads entirely. Whether it was every other winter or only during the very worst years, the fear of it lived fresh in everyone's hearts. You can feel it here, a shared quiet dread that knots the belly tighter than hunger alone. That night, you lie awake again, the inside of your mouth tasting stale, trying not to think about what else you might have to eat if the stores run out. Your dreams twist into strange shapes, gnarled hands offering you bowls of thin soup that turn to ash on your tongue. You wake more tired than you slept, realizing starvation isn't just about the body weakening. It haunts your mind first, creeping in to whisper ugly little suggestions long before your legs ever give out. By now, the darkness feels almost like an extra villager, looming close, whispering nonsense, always nearby. Each night comes too early, and with it, a deep, creeping unease. You're starting to understand why medieval Icelanders filled these long hours with stories of things lurking just beyond the glow of a lamp. One evening, as you crouch near the hearth, nibbling on a miserly chunk of dried fish, someone starts telling a story that curls around the edges of your mind like icy mist. It's about a draugr, a sort of undead being, swollen and blue, who rises from his grave to torment the living. You shift uncomfortably, trying to play it cool, but the way the old storyteller leans in, lowering his voice to a ragged whisper, makes the tiny hairs on your neck stand straight up. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Iceland's medieval sagas are filled with ghosts, revenants, and other night stalkers. These tales weren't told for fun. They were warnings wrapped in folklore. In a land where dying from exposure or hunger was frighteningly common, it made sense to believe the dead might stick around, restless and unsatisfied. Then comes your quirky tidbit. Alongside ghostly legends, you also hear hushed talk of wolves. Though wolves vanished from Iceland's wilds not long after human settlement, likely hunted out by the very first colonists, fear of them lingered in old poetry and law codes for generations. Some locals even left small offerings on stone piles, just in case something with sharp teeth still roamed the hills. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were half-remembered holdovers from Norway or a uniquely Icelandic twist on much older Norse superstitions. After the story finishes, no one laughs. The wind chooses that moment to rattle the turf house door, making it jump on its hinges. A small child squeaks and hides under a cloak. Even you find yourself clutching your blanket tighter, suddenly hyper-aware of every groan and sigh of the walls. Later, you try to sleep, eyes squeezed shut. It's no use. Every scratch of a mouse sounds like claws. Every swirl of wind becomes a low, hungry growl. You turn over, then back again, listening to your heart race. Someone coughs in the darkness, wet and hoarse, and you jump as if they've screamed. Scholars still puzzle over how deeply these fears soaked into daily life. Were people genuinely terrified each night of spirits and shadowy beasts? Or did they spin these stories as coping mechanisms, a way to give voice to deeper anxieties about starvation, disease, or the merciless cold? Out here, shivering on your straw bed, you're pretty sure it doesn't matter. A good ghost story in the pitch dark does its job either way. Eventually, fatigue drags you under. In your dreams, wolves with glowing eyes watch from ridgelines, while blue-skinned corpses shuffle through drifts of snow, whispering your name in voices that rattle like bones. You jolt awake hours later, throat dry, blinking into the blackness that's so thick it feels like a blanket pressed right over your face. Daylight, when it finally scrapes across the horizon, feels like a half-hearted promise. You trudge outside, skin prickling at the icy slap of the wind, hoping maybe to wash your face, to scrub away at least some of the grime and fleas. Except, here's your rude awakening. Bathing isn't exactly a daily, or even weekly, ritual. Your host family gestures toward a wooden tub that's been cracked and patched so many times, it looks like a giant wooden hedgehog. They fill it with water from a nearby stream, which is so cold it might as well be freshly melted glacier. You dip your fingers in and yank them back, gasping. Your host laughs, claps you on the back, and wades in up to his shins, face twisted in stoic misery. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Icelanders didn't bathe often by modern standards. Hot water was a luxury, unless you lived near a natural geothermal spring, in which case you were the envy of the region. Most folks settled for occasional cold rinses, just enough to keep outright disease at bay. You strip off your filthy layers, wincing as you reveal skin mottled with bites and raw spots. The water feels like 1,000 tiny knives. You yelp loudly and immediately lose any hope of looking tough in front of the locals. They grin at your theatrical horror. One woman, wringing out her hair, tosses out a wry comment that's probably something like, "City folk always scream the first time." A quirky tidbit? Some 13th century Icelandic law texts included fines for people who didn't keep themselves at least marginally clean when attending gatherings, because even back then, nobody wanted to sit next to the stinky guy. Scholars still argue whether those codes reflected daily expectations or were desperate attempts to impose order on naturally pungent realities. When you finally stumble out of the tub, shivering so violently your teeth chatter like castanets, someone tosses you a length of rough wool. It's itchy and still damp from someone else's earlier wash, but you clutch it to your chest anyway. A breeze cuts across your freshly chilled skin, and you almost long for the smoky reek of the turf house again. Later, after you pull your stained tunic back on, you realize it doesn't even feel like an improvement. The grime of medieval life isn't something you can rinse off in one freezing dip. It's baked in. Smoke, sweat, sour milk, sheep, and the inevitable tang of bodies that simply can't bathe every day. That night, nestled once again among coughing bodies and twitching dogs, you catch a whiff of yourself and wince. But then you realize everyone smells roughly the same. The turf walls trap heat, sure, but they also hold every odor. Eventually your nose seems to give up, retreating behind some protective mental barrier. Or maybe your brain just accepts that stinking is one more way of blending in. You drift off to the sound of someone gently scratching their scalp, the rustle of lice being dispatched one by one. The wind prowls outside, rattling the house, while inside you stew in your own peculiar human broth, trying to pretend it's somehow warm and comforting. Days slip by, each one blurring into the next. Hunger's a steady companion now, humming quietly under your ribs no matter how much dried fish or sour whey you choke down. Your hands stay cracked from cold, your nails edged in black grime that just won't scrub away, and your feet, don't even get started. The constant damp has given you raw patches that look suspiciously like the beginnings of frostbite. One gray afternoon, you watch as your Icelandic hosts work to repair fishing lines and patch nets, their movements methodical, almost meditative. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Fishing wasn't just a supplement in medieval Iceland, it was a lifeline. With limited crops and unpredictable grazing, the ocean was their primary pantry. Men risked icy waves and sudden storms in open rowboats for cod, haddock, and even seals. You help untangle a snarl of line, fingers going numb despite the work. Someone tells you, through gestures more than words, about men lost at sea last winter. They make a sort of sweeping gesture, hands rolling like waves, then tap their chest solemnly. It's a little ritual of memory, part of a long tradition of families keeping alive the names of those swallowed by the sea. Your quirky tidbit, it's believed some fishermen tuck small charms or bits of carved bone into their clothing, meant to ward off drowning. Modern scholars debate whether these were actual widespread superstitions or just local oddities picked up by curious saga writers. But watching these people set out into waters that look like pure liquid death, you'd believe almost anything to keep hope afloat. A few days later, you're invited to tag along on a fishing trip, more because they want your extra hands than your skill. The boat's low to the water, every wave slapping its hull so hard you feel it in your teeth. Salt spray cuts your face, and within minutes, your gloves are soaked through. Your stomach turns in tight, miserable loops. The men hardly seem to notice. They haul lines hand over hand, eyes squinting against the brine, muscles working in calm rhythm, born of necessity. At one point, the boat tips sharply, and you let out a panicked yelp that earns a round of weary laughter. One fisherman claps your shoulder, grins with only half his teeth, then mimics your terrified face in a surprisingly accurate pantomime. Even here, in the grip of cold that could kill in minutes, there's room for a little gallows humor. When you finally stagger back to land, legs rubbery, hands so cold you're certain you'll never bend them again, you've learned something essential. The ocean is both cupboard and coffin here. Without it, no one survives. Back on shore, your legs still feel like they're rocking with invisible waves. The air tastes richer somehow, less sharp, more like iron and wet moss. You watch the fishermen sort through their modest catch. A handful of cod, a few lumpfish that look outright monstrous with their bulbous heads and toothy mouths. They clean them right there on the stones, guts steaming in the cold air. A couple of skinny dogs circle, tails wagging low. One man tosses a fish spine to the nearest hound, which grabs it so eagerly you'd think it was a feast. Then he flicks the offal into a pit dug just beyond the turf houses, an open, reeking hole that buzzes even now with flies that somehow survive the chill. You breathe through your mouth. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Very little went to waste in medieval Iceland. Heads were boiled down for broth, skins dried for everything from shoes to sacks. Even bones were sometimes ground and added to stews for the tiny bits of marrow and minerals they offered. When you live on the edge of starvation, you become a master of turning scraps into survival. Someone presses a shallow bowl into your hands. Soup made from today's fish, thin and oily, but hot enough to thaw your frozen belly. You sip gratefully. Then someone else leans in, grinning, and drops a hunk of meat into your bowl with a flourish. It looks like maybe heart? Liver? Hard to say. A quirky tidbit: Icelanders were famously fond of organ meats, believing them to be the strongest, most life-giving part of the animal. Scholars still argue whether this was a practical peasant habit, or if there was also a ritual pride in consuming the noblest cuts. As you chew, the liver's earthy tang coats your tongue. It's surprisingly rich, almost luxurious after days of dry fish. The locals watch your face closely, clearly amused to see if the squeamish foreigner will gag again. You manage a tight smile and nod. They burst into relieved laughter, slapping your back so hard your teeth rattle. As darkness drapes itself yet again over the settlement, always too soon, always too heavy, you walk back to the turf house with the others. They chatter softly, but their eyes are trained on the horizon, scanning for shifting clouds that could mean another storm. Inside, you collapse onto your pile of hay and scratchy wool, full for once. Not satisfied, never that, but full enough to let your mind wander. Someone starts singing a low, droning tune that sounds like it might last until morning. The notes twine around you like a lullaby and a lament all at once. Scholars still puzzle over the role of these long, slow songs. Some say they were work chants meant to pass the time while carting wool or twisting rope. Others think they were meant purely to soothe minds battered by endless dark and biting cold. Either way, it works. Your eyes drift shut, and for the first time in what feels like ages, you almost believe you'll dream of something warm. When you wake, it's to the muffled sound of people bustling around in the dim pre-dawn. Someone stirs the hearth back to smoky life, and you catch the sharp tang of singed wool as a sleeve brushes too close. You rub your eyes, blinking through the haze. Every surface is stained the color of old earth, from the sod walls to the sagging beams overhead. You're starting to forget what clean white felt like. Outside, you find yourself recruited into yet another vital chore: gathering seaweed. A group of locals trudges down a slippery, frost-laced path to the rocky shoreline. The tide's out, revealing long, slick ribbons of kelp and bladderwrack. You watch as they pile it into rough baskets, laughing and trading barbs in voices that crackle like the cold air. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Seaweed was an essential supplement to Iceland's diet and economy. Families dried it for food, boiled it into jelly-like soups, and even fed it to sheep when grass ran thin. Without these dark, briny strands, many would not have made it through lean years. You reach down and peel a slimy length of kelp from a stone. It clings stubbornly, almost like it doesn't want to be eaten either. The locals show you how to twist it into tight coils for easier carrying. Your gloves quickly become soaked, fingertips numb all over again. As you work, someone grins and pops a piece straight into their mouth, chewing with a contented little nod. You decide not to follow suit, at least not until true desperation sets in. Your quirky tidbit? Some old Icelandic households use dried seaweed as bedding filler, literally sleeping on piles of crispy, salty fronds. Scholars still puzzle over how common this practice actually was, versus how much it pops up simply in scattered folk references. Either way, you can't imagine it being much more uncomfortable than the straw poking your ribs back at the turf house. As the sun, such as it is, creeps across the low sky, you carry baskets back up the path, shoulders burning. Every breath tastes of salt. Back at the settlement, the seaweed spread out over low racks to dry. You catch yourself thinking how, by tomorrow, it'll crunch underfoot like old paper. By next month, it might be in your bowl. Later that night, huddled once more under coarse blankets, you realize your sense of what's normal is shifting. A week ago, you would have recoiled at the idea of living on fish heads and frozen milk, of sleeping cheek to jowl with lice and hungry dogs. Now, it's just another night, just another round of hoping the wind doesn't pry the roof off or the meager stores run out before spring. A child across the room fusses, then quiets as her mother hums an old lullaby. It's slow, lilting, almost like it's trying to rock the dark itself to sleep. Your eyelids grow heavy. As you drift off, it strikes you that even with all the hunger, cold, and fear, these people find scraps of gentleness wherever they can, like tiny warm coals they keep alive against the endless Icelandic night. You're not sure when exactly it happens, but at some point the endless dark begins to loosen its grip, just barely. Days linger a little longer. A frail glow hangs on the horizon even after supper, painting the snowy slopes in delicate pinks and golds before they sink back into shadow. It's so subtle you might think you've imagined it, but the locals notice too. Their voices lighten, their shoulders don't slump quite as much. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Icelanders marked these tiny shifts obsessively. Their entire year revolved around precise seasonal divisions, settled in law codes, chanted in old calendar rhymes, watched for in the stars and sun. Missing the brief window to shear sheep, to harvest hay, or to dry fish could be fatal come next winter. Someone points out a faint ring around the moon one night. They nod grimly, an old sign that bad weather's coming. The sky might be brightening by inches, but the danger isn't past. A storm could still sweep in tomorrow and smother everything in white for weeks. Meanwhile, your quirky tidbit, Icelanders had an odd little superstition that if you stared too long at the northern lights, those eerie, dancing green ribbons that sometimes slip across the sky on clear nights, they'd reach down and snatch you up. Some people even claimed the lights were spirits of the dead, or unborn children laughing across the firmament. Scholars love debating whether these tales were rooted in pre-Christian beliefs or just playful winter scare stories. Either way, when you finally see the aurora flickering above the ridges, it's easy to believe the old fears. The sky feels alive, like it might actually lean down and whisper your name. Still, people here seem to have a gift for finding hope in small things. A Yui births a pair of wobbly lambs, and the whole household comes out to watch, cooing softly as the tiny creatures stumble through their first breaths. Someone uncorks a skin of sour ale saved for just such a moment. You take a sip. It tastes like vinegar left out in the rain, but you grin anyway, savoring the little ripple of celebration. Later, you settle back into the turf house. The same dogs sprawl across your feet, the same fleas nibble at your wrists, but it all feels a touch less menacing. The hearth crackles low, filling the dim room with a gentle orange pulse. Across from you, an old man runs a comb through his beard, humming a song that could be 200 years old. Scholars sometimes argue that medieval Icelanders were almost uniquely prepared to endure hardship, hardened by centuries of marginal land and brutal winters. Or maybe, they muse, these people simply had no other choice. So they found comfort wherever they could, in stories, in songs, in brief flashes of joy when a newborn lamb nuzzles your palm. You lie back on your bed of straw and coarse wool, staring at the rough beams overhead, feeling your breath slow. Outside, the wind is just a sigh tonight. Maybe tomorrow will be brighter still, by a few heartbeats at least. It's not much, but out here, even that small promise is enough to keep you hoping. So now, as the turf house settles into quiet, you let your own breathing lengthen. Feel how the cold no longer bites quite so sharply. Your body finally learning to share its little hearth of warmth with itself. Beyond these mossy walls, the endless snows lie hushed, wrapped under the sleepy glow of faint stars. Imagine the soft shuffle of sheep in their pen, the gentle sigh of dogs curled against each other. Even the wind seems to murmur a lullaby tonight, smoothing over the scars of all those hard days and harder nights. You let your mind drift, picturing the pale ribbons of the northern lights, gliding lazily overhead, silent dancers that promise tomorrow might come with just a breath more light. And as your eyelids grow heavier, sinking toward dreams, you understand a little of how these people survived, not through brute strength alone, but by cradling tiny embers of hope against the frost. So you rest now, wrapped in their borrowed stories and the distant lull of an Icelandic night, drifting easily into a slower, softer darkness where even the cold feels tender.